Hello everyone, today we talk about the North African political landscape during the 13th century. We never really addressed the history of this region on Schwerpunkt, especially century by century in sort of political depth, so here we go. I made, however, multiple videos about North African in Islamic Sicilian warfare, together with lots of things about so-called broadly meant or called Moorish warfare. We talked about southern Spain, Al-Andalus, and more. You know, we have also pretty hefty medieval Islamic history content on Schwerpunkt. It's, of course, minority for different reasons, but, of course, to have a full comprehensive picture of the depths also of the Western Christian reach, right? It's important to look at these specific powers as well that are really interesting on their own and reveal very, very fascinating regional provincial dynamics that we will highlight for essentially the full 13th century in this video. Of course, we will also make other ones of the same kind. We start with Morocco, right, and its sovereign Abu Yusuf, who, in his rise to power, discarded basically all facade of loyalty to the Hafsids. We'll understand now why. Intent as it was on securing his imperial legacy through a holy war in Spain. I made a video talking about Alfonso X's Afro-Iberian imperial ambitions, and this video partly ties into that because, as we will see now, the relations with the Christian Iberian, also Italian world, were quite robust. We are at the peak of the great medieval civilization, and these Islamic North African power were taking part in this ideology. In a moment, it was quite delicate for them because, indeed, Western Christendom was escalatingly crashing regarding, especially like probably North African demographic and economic potential was pretty limited. But there was something really enormous also having happened in the East, namely the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate, probably the killing of the Caliph by the Mongols, who had razed, in fact, the city of Baghdad to the ground, which was one of the greatest tragedies in the history of mankind, considering the treasures that were stored there. And we'll make more videos about probably the moral effect that this had on Islam. It was very much aware of this blow, more than, for example, the same Crusades. Now, the reason why Abu Yusuf Yaqub, the Marinid Sultan of Morocco, the reign was between 1258 and 1286, so also a pretty consistent one, maintained a facade of loyalty to the Hafsids to stabilize his early reign and avoid immediate war with a powerful neighbor, revolve around the fact that the Hafsids, based in Ifriqiya, so modern Tunisia, we'll see it better later, claimed caliphal authority as successors to the Almohads. Right, and this revolving essentially around the Al-Andalus legacy, and again, what had recently happened exactly in the same year of Abu Yusuf Yaqub come to power, because that's when Baghdad had been destroyed. So when we look at these rulers, we look at, there is an interesting civilizational comparison, like Sicily, Italy, and Germany had Frederick II, Castile, Spain at large had Alfonso X. You have a Louis IX, you have an Henry III. Like, there are big names, right, in the 13th century. Abu Yusuf Yaqub was definitely the Moroccan one in this picture. So the Almohads had suffered, as you know, at the beginning of the century, the heaviest blow with Las Navas that had opened wide Al-Andalus to the Christian conquest, but they were not done yet. Like they, as we'll see now, had still some avant-post in Spain. But other Islamic powers were now eager to claim their own universal legacy that at some point we described in other videos. Again, you can search for this. I have all strictly cataloged by order, by topic, by region, by period in my playlist. By feigning allegiance, Abu Yusuf avoided antagonizing Abu Zakaria Yahya and his son al-Mustansir, that we will see now in a while, whose influence extended to Fez and Tlemcen as well. All right, because that big power vacuum, it was not just about Spain, but about also essentially the Moroccan base from which the Almohads had started from. And so this pragmatic diplomacy, noted by Ibn Abizar in Ravd al-Kirtas, allowed him to consult Abu Yusuf Yaqub to consolidate power in the region while preparing for his ambitions in Spain and Tlemcen. So even an Islamic coming back in Spain, which we tend sort of, neglecting. We made a video, for example, about the Battle of Rio Salado. There were events like that was the last in the 14th century that is late enough that really show how Islam had still sort of expansionistic ambitions, regardless of the fact that, of course, that the tides had heavily turned by that point in favor of the Christians. So the Marinid ruler discarded this facade to assert his independence against the rival Hafsid prestige. As a Marinid sultan succeeding the same Almohads, Abu Yusuf Yaqub, driven by ambitions to rival the Abbasid Caliphate legacy, sought especially to legitimize his rule by championing jihad, right, as a sort of imperial manifestation. In other words, jihad required some specific recognition, right, mandate. Was a great problem in Islam because, as you know, there wasn't evidently at this point like a central universal power, nor there was actually a priestly class that could simply also legitimize this or that imperial title. So it was mostly a continuous, as relentless struggle between the same Islamic powers, and the simple imperial manifestation, as far as that was concerned. This was also cyclical in North Africa, as we were saying before, because if you think about the Almoravids, the Almohads, also the earlier Islamic invasion of Spain had come at waves, and so there was a sense of cyclicity, of continuity, and so perpetual struggle as far as the recapture, especially of the Al-Andalus, was concerned. Besides, the Marinid Sultan had yet another rival in the moment in which the Nasrids of Granada rose to influence. Right, these were essentially vassals of the Christian powers of the Iberian Peninsula, and as such, they basically were allowed to remain there. In fact, their conquista did not really end in 1492 when Granada was taken, rather in 1212 when, after Las Navas, all other Muslim powers in the Iberian Peninsula accepted the Christian overlordship. All right, but as a matter of fact, we also looked at the various Iberian kingdoms' policies that starts to become even more messy than before to an extent at this point, because essentially, yes, this wide south is open, but in that sense, there is a sort of rush towards that, especially by Castile, but still with certain border issues with Portugal, with the Crown of Aragon, that we documented, in fact, and that were cleverly exploited by these Muslims, also seeking, for example, external support, for example, Genoa. We'll look at this at this point. The key author that documented through his chronicle these events, mostly for the issue of the Marinid Abu Yusuf Yaqub and his rivalry with Granada's Nasrids, is the aforementioned Ibn Abizar in Ravd al-Kirtas. So Abu Yusuf Yaqub's claim to jihadist legitimacy, as the aforementioned source emphasizes, was partly a response to the same Hafsid's adoption, at least of the caliphal title of at least Ifriqiya proper, so roughly today's Tunisia. As such, arising the banner of jihad, and so of this more collective effort against the Christians, Abu Yusuf, as a rival Islamic leader in the Western Mediterranean, because between Morocco and Tunisia, there is not just Algeria in between, but in fact, especially more for medieval standards, a vast space. Even though, as we'll see now, it was covered, especially as far as coastal control was concerned. A contest further intensified by the Almohads' loss of Seville to Castile in 1248. As I was saying before, the Almohads had actually not disappeared after Las Navas, and the actual takeover of Al-Andalus bit by bit was something that the Christian kingdoms were still strategically and logistically struggling to achieve because of the distance, because of the pressures. Again, I made multiple videos about 13th, 14th century, especially Castilian history, that exemplify these issues. And again, there were some inherent political and institutional problems in the domestic affairs of those kingdoms that really put enormous strains to the successful seizure, especially direct control of these territories. The Christians had historically been habituated to launch these major raids towards the south, also from centuries well before the collapse of Islam, at least of the major regional power in the south. But raids are different from conquest and even from state building, direct build-up, and so on. After taking Sicily Masa, and concluding a truce with Yagmurasan, we will see now these are. The Marinid ruler embraced the Nasrid Sultan of Granada's call, however, to invade the Iberian Peninsula, because at that point they still felt threatened by the Almohads in a sense, and that's how Abu Yusuf Yaqub received Algeciras and Tarifa as a strategic foothold. Right, so a sort of enfeoffment from the same Nasrids by saying, seize those because we can the same Almohads and also have this foot into Spain that can help sort of rekindling the same jihad there. Now, Abu Yusuf retook Sicily Masa from the local Zenata Berber tribes who had seized control amid the Almohad decline as well, because again, there is a specific North African hinterland reality. Sicily Masa is really in the Moroccan hinterland, probably in a continental dimension. The Zenata Berber tribes had been, in fact, themselves loosely allied with the Almohads in a sort of tributary connection. And now they were exploiting the power vacuum to dominate the what was an oasis, right, in Sicily and Masa, that is located, in fact, in southeastern Morocco near the modern town of Rissani. At the time, it was really a vital trans-Saharan trade hub connecting the Maghreb to West African gold and salt markets that, as we'll see now, were also quite internationally connected, especially with the Italian presence in the Portugal centers at the end of these trade routes. Abu Yusuf, recaptured around 1257, as described by Ibn al-Khatib, secured Marinid economic power in a strategic base for Abu Yusuf's campaigns, especially in the east, reinforcing the frontier area, and his control over the same southern trade routes. Yagmurasan, we will see him now, was reigning between 1236 1283 as the founder of the Ziyanid dynasty, lording over Tlemcen, that was this commercial and strategic city in basically today's modern western Algeria. So they are on the eastern side of Abu Yusuf. And this guy, the Yagmurasan, was a Berber leader. He established the Ziyanid independence by balancing tribal alliances and trade with Aragon, for example, making Tlemcen a rival to Marinid Fez. The Marinids under Abu Yusuf fought Yagmurasan to assert regional dominance and control Tlemcen's wealth, particularly its role in trans-Saharan gold trade. And the conflict is detailed in the Kitab al-Istibsar, stemmed from Marinid ambitions to unify the Maghreb under their rule, and countered by Yagmur Hassan's resistance to maintain Ziyanid autonomy, and all this leading to a truce that temporarily eased tensions. Because Algeria, we can't so call it in this context, was essentially the weaker of the major North African power. Okay, of course, excluding Egypt, it is just something on its own, regardless of the North African position. But Morocco and Tunisia were the more developed places. We'll talk about medieval Algerian history as well in depth, because it will impart something about itself now, but it's really interesting to see how power was balanced in what was essentially the control over major centers for North African standards towards the coastland and the sort of more fertile plains of the interland, but also especially in fact further interland semi-nomadic tribes that were often the fuel for further political upheaval and required sort of a very complicated way of handling, mostly having your court, for example, passing through them and, brokering favors, and a test of political force that can be seen in the region also during the Renaissance from European observers and more. It's very interesting. There are lots of anthropological aspects to analyze about it. Yagmur Hassan ibn Zayyan had a lot of diplomatic acumen, as noted in the Saint Ziyanid Chronicles, of course, to some degree. And he, as we've seen, was also involved leveraging Tlemcen's position on trans-Saharan trade routes to fund his own military, a factor that compelled Abu Yusuf to prioritize this truce to avoid a two-front war with, in fact, both Tlemcen and Castilla in the north, which was the main power, having, as we were describing in the aforementioned video about Alfonso X, some veritably imperial universal ambitions, not just over the entire Iberian Peninsula, but also on part of North Africa. We've seen also the limits of that. It's not like Alfonso simply could, take over North Africa. Sometimes I receive questions that say, well, why didn't that happen? But people seem to have some strange perception of, ancient powers to the degree of probably the feasibility of certain political and strategical achievements. They confuse it for 19th century nation states that can occupy, conquer, secure everything in the moment, and that it's sort of properly against what all we know about the incredibly delicate balance of medieval political powers. It could be also in ancient history for that matter. I also made, by the way, some videos about the Roman provinces of at least Morocco, to North Africa. They're in part intertwined with this because, as we'll see, there was some Roman legacy, of course, to North African political development, still obviously at this point as well. There is a triumph scored by Abu Yusuf at XIII in 1275. Essentially, this was a Marinid military victory led by Abu Yusuf against Castilian forces in southern Spain, near, in fact, the town of Echija, in modern Andalusia. Responding to a call from Nasrid Sultan Muhammad II of Granada, Abu Yusuf had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with his own Marinid army, defeating the Castilian one under Nuno González de Lara. We talked about him in other videos. The battle, celebrated in Ibn al-Khatib's accounts, bolstered Abu Yusuf's reputation as a jihadist leader and secured Marinid footholds in Algeciras and Tarifa as the Nasrids had promised to them. Right. However, as we'll see now, it was more a successful raid than a territorial reconquest, reflecting, of course, the limited scope and even potential of Marinid campaigns in Iberia at this point. Right. In fact, This victory could not obscure that the war was characterized rather by some very fleeting windows of opportunity, right? In Abu Yusuf's 3 later campaigns that are 1277, 1282-83, and 1285-86, there is much more some kind of reciprocal testing and even negotiations going on to broker some deals, alliances, because this area of the southern coast of Spain was a bit too distant, a bit too, at least, much of a stretch for the political and military capacities of these powers in the moment. And so you would have fluctuating, for example, alliances with Granada and Castile rather than, a clamorous jihad that evidently was also not enough fueled nor basically in the moment anymore, right? This is not the 11th or the 12th century. The Christians had basically broken Andalus's back, and so these North African powers can do just so much. We shouldn't underestimate them because, again, especially Morocco had even some important naval capacities. We'll see better in some other video. Nevertheless, again, there is also some, we understand this better, even some level of public power frailty in general in these Islamic powers that is also kind of typical of the era. Now, the aforementioned alliances with Castilla and Granada, particularly with the former under Alfonso X, ruling between 1252 and 1284, so more or less the same years of Abu Yusuf himself, reflected the latter's pragmatic diplomacy to counterbalance Nasrid Sultan Muhammad II, that ruled between 1273 and 1302, as, yes, these guys had called the Marinids into Spain, as we've seen, but now were, in fact, also thanks to that, and the distraction, right, that this Moroccan invasion had procured, being growing in influence themselves. After all, the Nasrids in Granada had a very sort of entrenched, as you know, encastellated highland position that would be very difficult to dislodge until, in fact, the 2 centuries after. There were also Castilian ambitions to dominate the Strait of Gibraltar, obviously, complicating Marinid goals. And this is recorded by Ibn al-Khatib. Especially the capture of Seville would be the major Castilian outlet on the Atlantic. It would be fully developed only, say, in the 14th century through the opening of the Atlantic route by the Genoese. But there is already a quite clear shift in power ratios in favor of the Castilians against the Moroccans. Regardless of all their feudal issues and, again, the difficulty of operating that far against an enemy of that kind, it was closer, right? Alfonso X's support for the Banu Ashkilula that were Nasrid rivals in Malaga. So essentially, as we'll see now better, yet a smaller state that antagonized against the main Nasrid dynasty of the area in southeastern Spain, as documented in Castilian chronicles, forced Abu Yusuf to navigate delicate balance, once again aligning with the same Muhammad II at that point to secure Algeciras. We're talking, as you know, the straits here that were the main object of contention, because they were literally the gate to probably inland operations and also very profitable for trade control, while avoiding direct confrontation at the same time with Castile's naval power that was gradually forming. I have a video, by the way, about the 13th and 14th century Castilian naval power. The Banu Ashkilula are very, very interesting. As a prominent Granadan family and rivals to the Nasrids based, as we've seen in Malaga during this period, descended from Berber elites. They held significant influence as governors and military leaders, often challenging Nasrid sultans like the same Muhammad II, as we've seen. And their rivalry stemmed from essentially disputes over power and, as we've seen, wealth in Granada's ports, particularly, in fact, Malaga's trade with Christian states, because Malaga had a very old history of Mediterranean trade. Of course, at this point, as we'll see now better, the main trade circuits were notoriously the Christian ones. The balance, the trade balance was overwhelmingly disproportionately in favor of Europeans, and this clan supported at times by Castilla's Alfonso X, so to undermine Nasrid authority, complicating in turn Marinid alliances with Granada, as of course these two powers tended to back each other against this minor rivals, and so tendentially also loathing the idea of simply having to share a border, but working for each other if there was at least someone in between, so the eternal balance. Nevertheless, Abu Yusuf's accomplishment granted him the distinguished title of Amir al-Muslimin, so literally the military commander of the Muslims in general in the region. He was, as far as it was recognized, embodied by the same royal city of Fas Jadid, or New Fez, which he erected above the old city as his government's seat. It's a display of power building. Comparable to the Nasrid's Alhambra, New Fez stood in fact as a testament to a patriarchal, patrimonial form of rule, a palatial household of chamberlains supplemented by the smaller households of his ministers and governors, all enclosed within fortified walls. The chamberlains comprised eunuchs, slaves, and freedmen in the typical Islamic guise, entirely reliant on their lord. This system, rooted in Almohad traditions, of course mirrored the Nasrid court under Muhammad II, where loyalty was secured through a network of clientage, ensuring the Sultan's control over diverse factions as described by al-Maqqari in Naf al-Thib. When the Almohads had emerged themselves from the south, they had first reinforced their Moroccan power bases rather than the broader Atlas as well, and then they had crossed into Spain. So there was, by this point especially, like a bit of a peak of this statal development in North African, the major North African powers, witnessing to the resources that were handled also by the hinterlands, right? They're not, again, as vast as the major southern European regions, but still they can concentrate an important amount of power. The Marinid court's reliance on clientage, as al-Maqqari notes, was reinforced by the strategic marriage of Abu Yusuf's daughter to Muhammad II's son, right? So cementing this Granada Fez axis, so to say, in a univocal dynastic direction, at least aside from the fact that, of course, this was like the Nasrid succession to the main line, in a broader international purpose of anti-Castilian, so probably stemming of Castilian expansion, a bond that in fact persisted despite later Nasrid betrayals at the detriment of the Marinids, because again the general role of Granada as a bulwark against Castile and sort of squeezing any possible highway to work across the straits, like to even think to invade Morocco, just to see some of the most prominent coastal centers was a thing. At least in the Renaissance, the Castilians, the Spanish in general, would go for. The Marinid ministers were drawn from the warrior aristocracy of the Banu Marin, so literally where the clan, the dynasty took the name from, whose heirs were in fact trained as cadets in the households of royal princes to ready them for their roles. This included, of course, religious, military training. At some stage in their careers, they were granted the title of Wazir, whether or not they held ministerial duties that, of course, entailed some, administrative, legal capacity. Below them were secretaries from the learned elite of the ulama, that were, as you know, essentially the religious scholars, and the udaba, that were instead sort of the more secular men of letters, right? For Rus education, Abu Yusuf founded the first of the madrasas, or colleges, which remain, in fact, still today Fez's pride, like in its skyline. Ibn Khaldun himself was one of such figure, importantly enough, prominent Islamic polymath, member of the Andalusian diaspora that constituted the core of this group, right? Lots of sort of Islamic intelligentsia that had fled Spain naturally took refuge in Morocco, just across the straits. Ibn Khaldun is slightly later, but it belongs to this kind of climate. He was born in 1332. He died in 1406. Born in Tunis to an Andalusian family exiled after Sevilla's fall in 1248, served the Marinids of Morocco as a diplomat and scholar. His Muqaddimah later analyzing the cyclical rise and fall of dynasties like the same Marinids, reflecting their independence and the aforementioned tribal cohesion, especially these interland warriors living, in fact, in this sort of less civilized clans that, however, were both like the Muscle, the few for the more structured powers along the coasts, lording over the larger sort of fertile areas that could enlist these troops that were flocking under their control and were relatively foreign, in fact, to the same more civilized parts of North Africa. So the use, we will see it now, foreign troops, including European mercenaries that were also top-notch. This picture we made, we described this in the video about North African and Islamic Sicilian warfare throughout a bit this entire period, contributed to the stabilization of these powers. Ibn Khaldun's diplomatic missions, as recorded in his autobiography, Al-Tarif, included negotiations with Castilian envoys in Seville, highlighting the Marinids' role as intermediaries in Iberian Islamic Christian relations. Jews from Al-Andalus or Fez's Jewish community may have held roles at court or in financial matters. Speaking of Marinid state, these Jewish courtiers, often physicians or financiers like the Banu Ifran in Fez, leveraged their expertise to navigate the Marinid court, a role paralleled in Castile under Alfonso X. I made a video about the Mudayar, the presence of Jews in Spain is of enormous historical importance and probably chronological depth. They worked themselves, as we've seen also in Central Europe, to back like more concentrated power, because the Jews, of course, by being a minority in either a Christian or Islamic controlled territory, were thus now reliant on basically public authority, including, by the way, supported by the clergy in the Christian case, to exactly carry out some roles that were, if anything, precluded, right, to the other so-called monotheistic religions followers. The Banu Ifran's influence, as described in Hebrew sources, extended to managing Fez's mint, right, because of the historical notion that, again, handling money was basically sacrilegious, in as much as, extra profit would have seen as a scam, like some false lack of absolute wealth. Eventually, of course, these activities were always present, and not just into Jewish hands. On the contrary, there were also other religious ways to get around this. More than else, the Christian societies that were the most affluent had forms of, having interest loans under the indication that basically the profit would be a compensation for the maintained wealth, the handled wealth in that case. The Islamic world was less socioeconomically competitive, right? But the Jews also there had historically been quite involved in trade activities, in in long range, in fact, commerce, mercantile, say, establishment and so on. As you understand, managing Fez's mint was a critical function given the Marinids' reliance, as we were observing before, on the gold dinars they obtained from Saharan trade that were all won essentially with the funds for their Iberian campaigns across the strait. So it's a majorly important office at the Marinid court. Administration, however, was also fairly basic. Again, there isn't an overwhelming civilizational or state or public development in North Africa, though a treasury existed. Of course, we're not talking Egypt, because again, Egypt, yes, it's in North Africa, but it's something else. We call it Egypt, right? So I made multiple videos, especially about medieval Egyptian warfare, and of course, also Egypt had its own deficits, say, compared to Europe in general, but it's really a completely different system. It's very, especially by Islamic standards, very Western-like, very sort of quite territorial, power concentrated and more. But we will talk about it better in another video. It's important to separate this area. Consider that North Africa was considered by the same, cradle of, at least of the Islamic golden age. Like if you look at Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, like a bit like the place, in 1000 and a Night, like a place where the wizards are, with these people that are barely Islamic, this intertwinement with paganism, etc. It's a bit like what the Saint Christians believed of these North Africans. On top of the fact that they were Islamic, there was something almost bastard, for example, in the Normans of Sicily that had partially mingled with at least the remains of those guys in the island. But regarding this primitiveness of power, and without getting too much also in the specifics of political instability, although a treasury existed in the Marinid state, managed by a secretary titled the Sahib Ashgalihim, or master of their financial affairs, quite an official title, centralized accounting was very limited. Specific revenues like rents were assigned to specific expenditures, such as maintaining a company of guards. That again, in many ways, the most important way, like you need these bands of thugs to maintain control, to beat the crowd, to maintain like a garrison, like patrolling the fortresses, etc., the palace. Designated individuals gathered these funds for particular purposes. So there was a great deal of private subcontracting. For example, the Great Mosque of New Fez, that is a quite important building in medieval North African art and architecture, was constructed by the governor of Meknes using income from the city's oil presses. And of course, just like in antiquity, it was a sort of evergetism whereby like the local aristocracy, the local establishment tended to mostly invest in these works for some higher power so that they could be co-opted and by the same, and just because they owned much of the power locally. Yet, and that was a case of a very, a splendid building for the times and places, yet typically governors treated their provinces as fiefdoms with only general accountability for their revenues. As a matter of fact, it was mostly, whatever you could squeeze from certain provinces, and then referring to Fez, Marinid Sultan. There are different authors you can look at, for example, from the mid-14th century, Ibn Marzouk, al-Musnad al-Sahih al-Azan fi Ma'athir Mawlana Abi Hasan, on these topics. Ibn Marzouk was a Tlemcen-born scholar serving the Marinid Sultan Abul Hasan, who ruled between 1331 and 1348. Documented, and we talk about him in the video about the Battle of Rio Salado, as a matter of fact, and so that's an interesting background to also these scholarly figures. who, like in this case of Ibn Marzouk, documented the fiscal decentralization that empowered governors like those in Meknes, a system that often fueled regional autonomy, undermining central authority as well to some extent, even though it was really the only one that could also actually highlight to exalt that level of power concentration, given what they got in exchange for these titles. Ibn Marzouk's accounts also reveal how Abul Hasan attempts to centralize taxation, inspired by Mamluk models that, as we were pointing out for Egypt, were actually quite advanced, were the ones advanced in North Africa, and were resisted by Marinid governors, exacerbating tensions that weakened the dynasty's cohesion, as a matter of fact. Again, even if you study, there is a wide literature. I had once the opportunity of studying this for modern history exam, mostly speaking of the Renaissance. If you look at the working properly of the courts of the North African Moorish powers at this point, you realize that they were very much still based on this kind of level of tribal support from different groups, rose and fall, and there was an incredibly delicate balance that had to maintain the coexistence of like a more concentrated power alongside models that were inspired to the Mamluks, to the Ottomans later on, and this Berber tribal warlike interland that was all but, of course, tendentially sanitary or centralized, right? So again, there were great difficulties to maintain these powers that, however, gradually outlined themselves, and especially in the later Middle Ages, that is the case. The renowned circle of equity referenced by Ibn Khaldun was more frequently disregarded than diligently followed, as he advises no justice without an army, for example, and this is incredibly relatable. No army without taxes, which is also incredibly relatable, and no taxes without wealth, which is even more incredibly relatable. Finally, no wealth without justice, which is also quite the case, but at least justice can spring out of something. So such a sort of vicious cycle as it may sound. It definitely depends on who wants to control that wealth that really matters. This is, by the way, for reference, Ibn Khaldun, Muqaddimah 11. For those people who say that I don't cite sources, yeah, because you're too much of a lazy blip to actually do anything. But actually listening to my lessons, I'm not going to do anything for you more than what I want. Rooted in the Almohad framework, the system nonetheless operated effectively. Right? Again, that legacy had been important, and it had been also quite well placed on the tracks of some sort of imperial militaristic ambition. In fact, the gradually polished Marinid elite upheld its authority over a tribal population on one side and an urban third estate on the other. This is very, very important. So keeping that glue together, the more civilized coastal areas, the more nomadic interland. Its difficulties stemmed from, however, the reliance on those same nomadic warriors that we were saying before. It was really a civilizational challenge to convert the Marinid bodyguards and mercenaries that were often actually Andalusian or even Castilian, and so Christian, into an army. Right, religion, as we've seen, was not quite a problem, considering that foreigners were actually preferred even to locals, as they were deemed more reliably dependent on the sovereign. The aklat or klot, meaning the mixture of Arabs brought from Ifriqiya by the Almohads, right? It's an interesting dynamic, also of slavery, of slave soldiery, for example. It's also very Islamic in many ways. Remained sufficiently foreign to ensure fidelity. We've seen also how many black Africans were present. Made some videos about that. We will get even a military historical unit. One, the black guards were in many ways also the foreigners of the situations, because they came from sort of the deeper bowels of, in fact, the black continent. That, yes, in part had historically been an habitual presence, especially as slave soldiers, since Arab times and even before. But that truly remained distinct from, in fact, the local Arab or Arabicized Berber world, also had been partly the Romanized one. However, the Marinids could not hold the increasing control of the Sahara south of the High Atlas by the Makil. There were Arab tribesmen moving southwest from the central Maghreb. Right? These are interesting figures because they were essentially originally nomadic allies of the Almohads that, as we've seen other groups capitalize on the Marinids' preoccupation with Spain and Tlemcen to dominate Saharan trade routes rather than the control over other fringe areas, challenging the authority of Abu Yusuf's successors in disrupting gold flows, for example, along the trade routes that connected Morocco to Mali. This is observed, for example, by Ibn al-Khatib. The Makil's rise, as Ibn al-Khatib details, in fact, was facilitated by their alliances with local Sanaja Berbers, allowing them to control key oases like Tuat, a shift that redirected Saharan commerce away from Marinid-controlled Sijil Mazda, that, as we've seen, had been seized in part for that specific purpose. This is very interesting because the oases could be at times even hundreds of kilometers away from one another, the major ones. And if you, say, switch the control of one or another, depending on, put in this regime or another, they would, these were all complicatedly aligned or misaligned with Marinid power and other ones in North Africa. You could really change the direction of major trade flow, and with very, again, also expensive goods, like, again, the slaves, ivory, gold in particular. And it's not like, as a Marinid ruler, you could do too much, like, okay, let's go into the Saharan hinterland to campaign. It would have been disastrous in many ways. So there was so much, to a degree, that could be done. And this tells you also about the general instability of the region. For example, dynastically wise, Abu Yaqub Yusuf, successor, 1286-1307, devoted the early years of his reign to campaigning against rebellious relatives. This is really typical of North African clans, including a son he had named governor of Marrakesh. And again, this is really typical. We see it also in feudal Europe in many cases. You understand that also the control of key cities, Marrakesh was quite important as well after Fez, were also just necessarily the cornerstone of power, as much as you had to place someone on there. So the point wasn't much their utmost loyalty, but the fact that it was still part of your lineage, and so that at least within this competition, things would hopefully remain within the clan. In fact, the Marinids went on for an important amount of generations. Abu Yaqub Yusuf, inheriting this this fragile Marinid state, faced challenges from his cousin Abu Thabit, whose rebellion in Marrakesh leveraged local Zenata Berber support from the hinterland. Again, that was always like, is there a war band up to a fight? Like, we can recompensate you with whatever we strip our competitors from. Yeah. Reflecting the dynasty's struggle to unify its fundamentally tribal base, as also chronicled by Ibn Abi Zar. Abu Thabit's revolt, as Ibn Abi Zar notes, was fueled by his claim to the Marinid throne, exploiting the death of Abu Yusuf's designated heir, Abu Yahya, in 1286, which destabilized the dynasty's succession. Spain and the Holy War were of minor importance in his strategy, that, as you understand here, was mostly a power struggle within Morocco. In fact, he lost Tarifa to the Castilians in 1291 and failed to reclaim it with a military expedition aimed at recuperating it in 1293, which was a broader shame considering the aforementioned caliphal authority in the regions. Like, if you didn't have enough manifest power, like all the other, especially in Islam, it has a deep distrust towards earthly authorities. Anyways, it was in this especially unstable tribal context, yet an immediate chance for rebellion and bloodshed, etc. Of greater consequence was Tlemcen, where Yagu Murasan's son, at that time Abu Sa'id Uthman, 1283-1304, had expanded his territories to the gates of Bushi, that is to say, Bijaya, the western capital of the Hafsids. This gives you a dimension of how also an Algerian power was basically consolidating. Abu Sa'id Uthman consolidating Ziyanid power, allied with the Hafsid governor of Bushi, Abu Zakaria Yahya II, to counter Marinid expansion, a strategy that exploited regional rivalries, of course, as noted in the anonymous Kitab al-Istibsar. Of course, especially the Algerians had to preemptively strike in some way or another, because, as we've seen, they were not just among the stronger of these three main regional entities, and they were especially caught in between the other two geographically. That wasn't even the major factor, of course. And geopolitics does not exist. Abu Zakaria Yahya II, Hafsid prince ruling Bushi semi-independently, leveraged this alliance to resist Marinid incursions while also navigating tensions with his cousin Al-Mustansir in Tunis, as we get all the sort of the latitude here of Western North Africa described in Al-Zarkashi's chronicles. Incorporated into the Moroccan Empire by the Almoravids in the late 11th century, we talked about those times, we will have to get a bit more in depth to those, frankly. Tlemcen had been reshaped by the Arab conquest in the early 8th century. Right, it's just as the Arabs would be entering Spain in a few years. By the way, from the unassuming Roman town of Pomaria, that was turned by the Arabs into a strategic fortress and commercial hub at the intersection of routes from Ifriqiya to Morocco, that had suddenly reacquired more robust importance, and from the Sahara to Spain, especially. Gaining independence under the Ziyanids, it acquired the benefit of a royal court, a significant island of purchasing power that drew long-distance traders. It's at this point, by the way, when the Arabs were reorganizing this sort of greater resources outside of their ancestral lands, that the term Makhzan, literally storehouse, treasury, came around. Makhzan is the same root word for the English magazine, right? It became the common term for government in the Maghreb as well, which also tells you how sort of relatively infrastructurally poor the system was. I mean, it were mostly like, of course, where let's say warehouses connected to markets, right? So not as majorly, permanently settled fortresses or centers of power, etc. Mostly, right? And this trade bias, if you want, neatly encapsulates the aforementioned circle of equity with reference to the state itself and its army, because it stemmed in North Africa from essentially the control over current routes, right, crossroads, this major, at times intercontinental highways right across continents, that it was important just to lord. For both the Ziyanid dynasty and merchants, Tlemcen was nearly a gold mine, as its special relationship with Aragon Catalonia in particular, because if you follow in just the longitude, you see that, of course, Algeria is more under the eastern part of Spain, and in that sense it's also more distant from Andalus, and that is necessarily connected mostly from a continental point of view with Castile, and then you have Morocco on the other side, via the port of Oran, really, positioned Tlemcen in turn as a key supplier of West African gold to the Mediterranean. Because even, again, if you go further south, latitudinally, you have the very straight routes to Guinea, to other, to Mali, etc., that from where lots of those precious resources came from. By the way, it's very interesting to find Italian merchants actually controlling most of this trade, right, and connecting these areas to the broader international markets that they themselves moved as the major financial engine of Western civilization. All opportunities for these local powers. Now, the relationship, however, with the Crown of Aragon is formalized under Peter III. I made a video just about him. He reigned between 1276 and 1285. It involved treaties granting Catalan merchants, in particular, that from Barcelona, of course, were already quite active. This was a moment of, essentially, of peak of that, the rise of the port. Privileged access to Tlemcen markets. Also rivalry with the Genoese, for example. There was a back and forth in that regard, but we're not going to discuss this. Bolstering Ziyanid wealth while fueling tensions with the Marinids, as evidenced in Aragonese diplomatic records. There are also some of the earliest statally wise available, where you have an excellent set of sources in Fincas Acta Aragonense. That is, for example, a source that I often use in my work. Peter III's treatise, as preserved in the archives, in fact, of the Crown of Aragon, also included clauses for mutual defense against Castilian naval threats, aligning thus the Algerian Ziyanid interests with Aragon's Mediterranean ambitions and complicating Marinid strategies in the process. Though the Ziyanids, like the Marinids, depended on a Makhzan, Ibn Khaldun, in the aforementioned passage, tells us of Berber and Arab tribes, they were far more closely associated with their city, Tlemcen, than the Marinids were with Fez. This is also kind of obvious given that Morocco had, as we've seen, more centers, different ones. You have the cities of on the strait, you have Marrakesh, you have sort of different areas that all alone also control sort of greater swathes of fertile territory and sort of more developed areas than most of Algeria. So there the power struggle is much more cumulative of different centers than concentrating, in fact, on one alone, even though, of course, tendentially it was the fort with making, as we've seen, Fez sort of the more important one. Creating a new empire, so to say, in the central Maghreb, however, was an innovative as difficult venture that challenged the monarchies of both Ifriqiya and Morocco. Actually, the Ziyanids expanded in between, mostly because of the power vacuum and the limits of the other two. Abu Yaqub Yusuf sought to seize their kingdom for himself, by the way. Major campaigns in the 1290s peaked in 1299 with the siege of Tlemcen itself, a formidable fortress by that point, also, as we've seen, with a Roman bases, etc., necessitating a prolonged effort. This also showed how more powerful the Marinids were to put under siege the major center in between, say, Tunisia and Morocco. Effectively, the Marinid Sultan relocated his capital to his siege encampment, which he developed into a substitute for the city he had surrounded. This is somewhat typical of certain very powerful rulers. It's like, I don't know, Frederick II that establishes a new city of victory next to Parma, like literally hoping to refound one and crush the smaller one. In North Africa, it was much, that failed, by the way. In North Africa, instead, it would have been theoretically much easier. Besides, as you understood, these courts were often itinerating, as it was also the case normally in Europe. to an important degree, regardless of the greater urban development. And this, of course, was a way to, because, of course, during a siege, any military expedition, the way to keep the forces together was moving with the treasury. And so you literally moved with your entire faculties. Most of your political stakes were holding into this enterprise. And so it was completely normal for peoples that were also ancestrally habituated to semi-nomadism, their sort of tribal itinerating lifestyle, to live like that. This encampment would in fact give rise to Al-Mansura, or New Tlemcen, that thrived on the commerce during the same siege of the old, including trade with the Catalan lands. So you have these guys besieging Tlemcen, and the camp becomes yet another market center that is recognized by the same Aragonese, to such an extent, by the way, that Yusuf was in no rush to conclude the siege of the Ziyanid capital. Al-Mansura's development, overseen by Abu Yaqub Wazir ibn al-Hakim, mirrored Tlemcen's commercial vitality, attracting merchants from Aragon and Genoa, which sustained Marinid ambitions until internal rivalries destabilized the campaign. As Ibn Khaldun notes, of course, the Catalan and Italian merchants were particularly happy to witness some broader stability in North Africa, so that the local rulers could grant them some kind of safer conduct through the region, and could facilitate the intercontinental trade. But of course, when war resumes, everything is blipped up in the process. And again, this is also typically North African. Ibn al-Hakim, a key figure in Marinid administration, also negotiated with Genoese envoys to secure maritime support for himself, a strategy that Ibn Khaldun critiques as, in fact, over-reliant on foreign alliances, and Christian ones, by the way, weakening Marinid sovereignty. And this, of course, had a cost. It was really more like the proof of the consequence of a crisis, that the cause of that, right? Requiring external support in a moment of particular difficulty. That may work, by the way. Actually, as von Clausewitz teaches, if a state cannot defend itself, he will not also receive support from its allies either. When the Marinid Sultan was assassinated in a palace conspiracy in 1307, Tlemcen had not yet fallen. This tells you this sort of forever war in part had triggered the same issue. The Moroccans at that point abandoned both the siege and their new city, which tells you also again how really fragile the entire system was. And the Ziyanids reclaimed, as a consequence, their territories. Therefore, also it had been a failed investment at large. And it really does tell you how important, anyway, this had been, because finding resources in that context was very difficult. And here they sort of bet everything on this failed siege at the end of the day. Dynastic aspirations remained vulnerable to dynastic mishaps. And the frontier between the Marinids and the Ziyanids remained always that kind of blurred. In Tunis, however, the same dynastic aspirations had succumbed to other political realities. For example, Abu Zakaria Yahya, the founder of the same famous Hafsid dynasty of Tunisia, passed away in 1249, succeeded seamlessly, which was already a thing by itself, by his son Abu Abd Allah, who would rule until 1277, and who in fact at that point assumed the aforementioned caliphal title of Al-Mustansir Billah, which is literally in Arab, commander of the faithful. We're in 1253. So again, that kind of jihadistic, but also universal kind of identity under the banner of the Hafsids, and in front of the neighbors. Here we're not even going to stretch as far as Cyrenaica, etc., but again, the very interesting things are happening also in Libya. Abu Zakaria Yahya, his father, he had started ruling from 1229, had began his career essentially as a former Almohad governor. So these guys had been raised probably in the previous regime that, again, the Almohads control. It were already sort of more decadent compared to the Almoravids, but as you know, they had also posed like a remarkable threat at the beginning of the 13th century to the Iberian Christians, and it had taken Innocent III substantial Western support, right, to the Reconquista to actually break the Almohads at Las Navas. Well, Abu Zakaria Yahya had established already his Hafsid dynastic autonomy by aligning with Ifriqiya's urban elites and Arab tribes, a foundation that, as we've seen similarly to other countries, in this case at least enabled al-Mustansir's not just statal but caliphal claims, which were bolstered by his diplomatic ties, by the way, with the Mamluks in Cairo, were definitely an important political influence as chronicled by al-Zarkashi. Al-Mustansir's Mamluk alliance, as the latter author's details, included exchanges of scholars and jurists, strengthening Hafsid legitimacy through shared Maliki legal traditions. These were one of the four major schools of Islam. It was incredibly important to foster also intercontinental sort of political, religious, and juridical ties to reinforce the respective polities, and in fact further founded their legitimacy within the sacred texts. But at the same time, for this very reason, it provoked suspicion from the Marinids that were very Ifriqiyan expansion. That was definitely, in the bigger picture, more threatening, right, to Morocco than, again, any Algerian power, for example. Acknowledged in Fez and Tlemcen the Hafsid ruler was briefly recognized by Mecca and Cairo after the Mongols killed the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad in 1258. So basically, al-Mustansir obtained such caliphal authority also as a consequence of the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate in the east. And it acquired, again, an unprecedented prestige that could make, in theory, probably Tunis the center of Islam in that instance. This tells you also how many big things were actually going on, regardless of the general sort of shortcomings of Islam at this point. So close to, say, Italy here in the age of Manfred of Sicily, for example. We'll see now how this also intertwines, because the Europeans had some important hold on North Africa, just out of sheer scale of power, and they could themselves extend a control that was reinforced paradoxically by this Islamic ideal as universal. The Christians in Spain had historically done precisely this, right? Actually styling themselves as the protectors of the Jews and the Muslims, as for example, the King of Castile seizing Toledo, or just of the Christians, right, for a more properly ecumenical kind of rule within what had been also, and I made a video about this, the universal tradition, the caliphal tradition of the Emirate of Cordoba, and the Caliphate of Cordoba, in fact, back in the day, within probably Iberia as a universe world within itself. So you understand how variedly overlapping and sort of far-reaching these ideas really are. Under this title, al-Mustansir revived thus the same Almohad Caliphate, which was, in the absence now of the Abbasid one, the only sort of, at least in this Maghreb-bine perspective, the more recent caliphal legacy from that side of the aisle. The Almohads, that as we've seen were not over yet, were retained in their tribal units as a militia under a sheikh of the same leading clan. While the Mahdist doctrine, emphasizing the Quran and the Hadith, was taught in the madrasas established in Tunis from Abu Zakaria's time onward, thus seizing basically that caliphal legacy from a still existing self-styled caliphs. By the way, it's interesting that that the Caliphate of Cordoba had historically been self-suppressed. I mean, they at some point they sit at a table. They said, "Look, this is not caliphal anymore because it's basically lost its universal nature," and they dismissed it themselves. But of course, other rulers would try to reinstate it on their own, including, in fact, the Almoravids and the Almohads. The Sheikh of the Almohads, of a Hentati tribal leader, maintained cohesion among these various units, would also recognize them as the caliphs, balancing their loyalty to the Hafsids against their own ambitions, a dynamic Ibn Khaldun later analyzed as a source of actual dynastic fragility, and he was right. The Hentati were a prominent group, like part of the Berber Masuda Confederation, who, while of Almohad origin, served themselves as a key militia under the Hafsid dynasty in Ifriqiya. So these were literal Almohads that had went over to Tunisia to bolster further that sense of caliphal legacy in a place that seemed like, okay, well, this may be a place where we can be co-opted to reinforce also this locally here, like through a new fortune, that caliphal power. In this role, the Hentati leaders, as Ibn Khaldun observes, often mediated disputes between the Banu Hilal and Banu Sulaim. There were these different Arab tribes in the region, ensuring Hafsid control over, in fact, the Ifriqiya's interlands where those lived, in a quite powerful sense. In fact, that would even put, autonomy-wise, a constant threat to the centralized rule of the same Hafsids. So you understand what complicated power playing was there at risk. By the way, these rulers really believed that it was a dynastic, probably a blood connection, so that you couldn't quite simply be yet somebody else, even if you were more powerful. And the disregard, for example, the legacy of the Almohads had really been big. And I can't stress this enough because, again, the greatest Islamic power had by far been the one of Spain historically. And so any kind of derivation here of power was in the broader region, in the Western Mediterranean, mostly connected with that. The regime's emblem was the Kasbah, or citadel of Tunis, constructed like new fence on the hill above the Madina, with its Almohad mosque and minaret overlooking the great mosque of the Zaytuna in the city's heart. So it's not like the Almohad legacy was simply novel there. Again, the extent of this rule had historically been perceived as universal by the actors involved. Politically and ceremonially vital, the Almohads integrated thus in Tunisia into a governmental structure similar to that of the Marinids that the Hafsids had basically established at this point from the same as in Almohad administration, including a Christian guard. Typically enough, this was also like the closest land to probably to Christian Europe. As we've seen, these Christians were well protected by the Islamic rulers, exactly to parry them from the attacks of these other shady clans that always were creeping, reaching for power in their stead. Mustansir permitted, if anything, the revival of the Malikite school after a century of decline. The Christian Guard was composed of Catalan and Sicilian mercenaries under al-Mustansir's vizier Ibn al-Liyani. It bolstered Hafsid defenses, but introduced also foreign influence, a tension noted in Sicilian chronicles. There were black troops as well that, for example, like, this is the case in Egypt, even, I don't know, with the Turks, etc., like, did trigger some kind of ethnic tension. Ibn al-Alyani, himself a Hafsid freedman of Christian origin, as noted by al-Zarkashi, used his position to broker trade agreements with Sicily, enhancing Tunis's wealth, but alienating traditionalist ulama who opposed reliance on non-Muslims. This aspect is very important because, as we will see in a video, especially about the 12th century, Sicily de facto exerted sort of a lordship over Tunisia historically. This, again, reflected Sicily. The Kingdom of Sicily was basically the single most centralized in Latin Germanic Europe, and was particularly in the last generations like a powerhouse that really was capable of projecting so much power around, regardless of the fact it was basically a feudal monarchy. It didn't have like a maritime vocation, like, for example, the Italian republics of the center of the north, that, however, did serve the same Sicilian crown, and in fact had a leverage on the same North African coast. And again, Sicily and Tunisia are very, very close, and that passage is also very strategic because from there you have all basically the west, the connection between the eastern, central, and western Mediterranean, and Tunis is just there. This is Carthage, basically. Like, if you realize also from ancient colonization, this vestiges of the classical past, why certain cities had historically been founded in these locations. And there were specific reasons. So it's very interesting that, by the way, an incredibly effervescent cultural, literary, philosophical context here. I will not digress because we will talk about it in another video, like the incredible amount of Siculo-Norman, Siculo-Swabian like level of literary scientific development on the basis, for example, of translations from the Arabic, from Hebrew, contact with Spain, with the Latin Empire at this point has been established. Like, so it's a moment again of major Catholic expansion of Christian power, would witness literally in Tunisia at the court of the Hafsid a freedman of Christian origin that would say to the Islamic ulamas, don't bother, right here we use Christian mercenaries, and deal with that, as Hafsid power was concentrating through that meaning. It's incredibly fascinating. And in fact, like the Sicilian connection there especially is strong, also the Catalan one, as we've seen. And by the way, there would be also different nationalities from the rest of the West. If anything, again, we will talk better about this in other videos. As in Tlemcen, the regime's splendor relied, in fact, from the start on trade with Sicily, the Italian city-states, and Barcelona, governed by treaties established and renewed from 1231 or indeed 1180, depends. Like, this is just how much we can trace with certainty, but onward. And of course, there had been other before, nor this would be the last. These treaties, negotiated with the stupor-wounded Frederick II of Sicily, reigning between 1198 and 1250. I have an entire playlist dedicated to the Hohenstaufen and specifically Frederick II. And later James I of Aragon, other very important player in the Mediterranean, ruling between 1213 and 1276, secured Hafsid access to Mediterranean markets. Right, the Italians especially dominated these. The Catalans were also emerging from one side, and so basically the Tunisians, by sort of investing in this, would follow the trail and also, profit from this trade exchanges. After all, they had the resources that Europeans were interested in. Channeling, for example, Saharan gold and slaves to Europe, besides as we've seen, the Islamic Spanish territories still made an important use of slaves in war. Like during the same Frederick II, as you know, there was a prominent Saracen guard that technically actually stemmed from the remnants of the Sicilian Muslims that in part were historically also just Sicilians that were, at least in this time, deported to the Apulian military colony of Lucera by the same Supermundi. But we have Genoese trade records that are actually quite vocal about this. Besides, the Italians really connected the Tunisian trade to basically most other Muslim ones in the rest of the Mediterranean, because again, the Italians really dominated the sea, and so they were this must for anyone who wanted to have any contact with the outer side, especially via sea. But considering that, as we've seen, even as far as Black Africa, unavoidably the dependency on these markets extended European reach far and wide to a shocking geographical degree. Frederick II's treatise, as preserved in Sicilian archives, by the way, included provisions for Hafsid merchants to operate in Palermo, right? So where also Frederick held his court at times. He preferred Apulia, telling the truth, but still, like, it was, of course, the major Sicilian center, and, as you know, historically connected to Tunisia with the Aghlabids, historically before the Normans ruling from there, especially with a commercial bias. In fact, in the same documents, the same Frederick is witnessed fostering a commercial network that in Palermo itself fostered a commercial network rivaling Tlemcen's alone and fueled Hafsid naval ambitions, right? Now, and this is, again, we were speaking of markets, because as we've seen, the Kingdom of Sicily was not much of a maritime force without the Italians, but having a market in there was also a matter of who frequented that market, so also who would access it regardless. And it's not like Palermo was merely just a commercial center, right? But it really was alone more powerful than Tlemcen, considering especially also the latter's centrality was between all those trade routes, the caravans, also the east and west axis along the North African coastline, with all these players scattered around. Inland, as we've seen, again, the comparison, especially with Europe, is unforgiving. The stability of Tunisia was undermined by the dominance, as we've seen, of these various Arab warrior tribes of the hinterland, mostly the Banu, Hilal, and Sulaim. A century after, Abd al-Mumin had successfully expelled the Norman avampost that had colonized the coastline from, in fact, Ifriqiya by land and sea, so recovering also some naval capacity. These factors combined to reveal the fragility of the new Hafsid caliph's claims. In fact, like, Europeans could simply walk in. During St. Louis' Crusader assault on Tunis, 1270, the Africans' zeal for holy war was countered by the invaders' military superiority, crushing military superiority, especially considering that at that time of the year, the Bedouins that came closer to the coastal areas and offered in this way also some warband support to the Hafsid were to even dislodge earlier to their southern winter pastures to exactly avoid fighting with the Crusaders. By the way, we never really made a video about the last crusade of Louis IX. As you know, like, one of the greatest rulers in the world in the period, in charge, so to say, as King of France between 1226 and 1270. It's such an enormous topic for so many reasons. Again, I have a medieval French playlist, but it's never enough. We must talk overwhelmingly about French politics, warfare, and society, because it's just the deal, especially at this point. And this crusade aimed to convert the same al-Mansura to Christianity. The ultimate goal was really universal, enormous, was essentially seizing Egypt, right? Not even going over to Jerusalem and trying to retake it, but knocking out the Egyptian Sultanate to simply, at that point, swarm across the Levant, recovering the entire Holy Land. It would have actually succeeded if, of course, things had not gone pretty wrong, as you know. In any case, just the mere presence of the largest military expedition of the year. By the way, the English, as you know, Edward I, I also made a video about this, would continue even after the failure. But the Aragonese also had mobilized an enormous army. It was just something huge. They would have really reconquered Egypt, like at least with that kind of strategic capacity and projection. Of course, everything could have gone wrong, but I mean, it's not like the Islamic powers, as we've seen, were doing anything better. So at least Tunisia would have been reduced at that point to a tributary state, especially now that France had acquired her properly Mediterranean port with the establishment of Aigues-Mortes in Occitania. And there is, of course, the failure of the crusade with the plague that breaks out. Louis dies. Here there is all an issue like with, because the better launching pad would have been Sicily, as a matter of fact. But Charles of Anjou did not really want that because, would have, of course, cost him something in terms of, of autonomy towards his brother at that point. And we've seen in a recent video that Charles made more money than his brother. Like the public income of the Kingdom of Sicily alone was something like 1,100,000 florins, whereas the French one at this point was 700,000. Something like. So this gives you an idea of the sheer magnitude of power that the West, even in individual states, had basically over any other power around. And this is utterly insane. In fact, even if the crusade failed because of the death of Saint Louis, the Hafsids' vulnerabilities had been vastly emerged. Ibn Khaldun states that quite clearly because it had been actually a major issue in Tunisia, right? The fact that basically the Crusaders could simply walk in and the local tribal fabric simply collapse, right, really tells you how, again, fragile the systems were under stress and foreign invasion. Louis IX's campaign, as described in French chronicles, we'll come to look at some of those soon for different topics, was partly motivated by, as we said, his brother Charles of Anjou's ambitions to basically control Sicily more directly, not sharing that. Of course, he supported his brother, but again, that decision was also the cause of the plague, as a matter of fact. In any case, highlighting the broader Christian Mediterranean strategy to curb Hafsid influence at that point as well. And this was not even a primary interest of the crusade, just as a byproduct of the same. As you know, Charles of Anjou was aiming at recovering, as it would happen. It wouldn't happen because of the Vespers, what was now the failing Latin Empire of Constantinople, when essentially the Palaiologi recovered the city. Now, after the death of the King of France, anyway, the Crusaders were paid off with a substantial indemnity and the renewal of tribute to the Kingdom of Sicily as well. So basically, Tunisia had not just to pay the Crusaders to dislodge from there, because they had simply stayed in a seigneurial fashion. And the Kingdom of Sicily managed to extract a tribute, not basically to simply stay there as well. And again, that was a very heavy blow for the Hafsids, and definitely not a great display of power comparatively to the Christians. From the Tunisian perspective, the crusade initiated Sicilian, followed by Aragonese interference in Hafsid affairs, to say the least, enabled by succession disputes also after triggered further after Mustansir's death in 1277. The main actors were Peter of Aragon and his sons, Alfonso of Aragon and James of Sicily. Right, the latter was the guy that basically took over, as we were saying before, the island after the Vespers. And so you have the Aragonese expanding quite closely. As we've seen, there was an ancient connection, especially with Algeria, Tlemcen, and this emerging Catalonian power, and Aragon seizing also the kingdom of Sicily from the other side of the lighthouse of Messina. And of course, again, these were not particularly happy times for anybody involved. There was a relentless war going on throughout all this period. This is the age of Roger de Flor. We talked about them. The Europeans were more rightly focused towards other abodes, merely like the Byzantine world, and or going at each other, because again, certain powers were really very profitable. It's the Sicilian ones we've seen itself, with now Naples being the most important chunk, what had remained to the Angevins. Now, Peter III of Aragon leveraged, of course, Aragon's naval power, flexing muscles in this case, exploiting further Hafsid division to expand influence in the Maghreb for himself, aligning with dissident Hafsid princes like Ibn al-Wazir in Bushi, as recorded by Ibn al-Shamma. All right, so it's very interesting, especially that these Iberian rulers would maintain such a keen awareness of the various North African power plays. Ibn al-Wazir, a Hafsid governor of Buji, as Ibn al-Shamna notes, sought Peter III's support to assert autonomy from Tunis, offering Aragon access to his city's port in exchange, a deal that destabilized Hafsid unity, to say the least. Their fleets seized Jerba in 1284 and the Kerkenna Islands in 1287. So we're talking about piratic activities that since the Saracen era had also characterized these peoples before at least the Italian Maritime Republic had inhibited them. As you understand here, the same Europeans used them as tools of their own political aims. Their machinations persisting until Alfonso's death in 1291 contributed to the further splitting of the Hafsids and their territories in two, basically. So there is an interland, a western part, so to say, the less civilized one, the rebels, if you want, that, however, are powerful enough to stay autonomous from Tunis. In fact, by the end of the 13th century, one branch of this Hafsid domain was based in Buji, the other in Tunis, while the southern desert also resumed its role under whom the Almohads, right? That's where they had ended up at this point, which is so dramatic, considering that they had been ruling from Cordoba at a point. In any case, this was still an important aspect, as the land became a breeding ground for pretenders. And again, the fringe is, as we learned also for Morocco, the most dangerous place where the next waves of conquerors really mostly come. And again, for internal power plays, even a more dynastic direction, as basically these powers, also the rest of North Africa and Eurasia would grow increasingly dynastic and statal, in particular North Africa, particularly more stable. And so this is important because it shows you how, like, the major deal here, that the backdrop of all this story is the collapse of Islamic Spain, that evidently sends the shock waves and across this entire region that had historically depended on Cordoba, and therefore, and also providing with the same manpower to reactivate the caliphal rule. And so this is also what we will have to deal with more in depth. Today's video is mostly like, again, the second half of the 13th century, even the beginning of the 14th, to see how the system was fundamentally adjusting. But there is really a lot going on. It is pretty dramatic for all involved. Like as we've seen here, especially European power was at its peak. And it's not like even after that it would lose much of its grip on the entire system. So it's of course the Muslims had gotten the worst of this, especially in the West. In the East, of course, it was different because the Crusades had largely failed, but they weren't over yet either. And as you see here, it's mostly like the Europeans decided not to do that anymore, rather than any particular lack of power that could even shatter quite easily a power like the Tunisian one, just like that. So it's always a history of scholar shortcomings deriving from enormous forces moving and that can sort of barely be controlled by these essentially provincial powers. Oasis cities like Biskra under the Banu Muzni fell to minor local dynasties, by the way, while the Arabs emerged as the arbiters of power within the Tunisian region. Again, we will surely talk more about this landscape because we just began to do so, and in many ways it's really not enough. We'll never really talk too much about these powers, but they are definitely ones worth being covered because they, as you understand here, link up also much of the narrative of the chronology of other powers, the same medieval Christian powers. And there is so much to say about this. I'm really glad, and I hope to cover, of course, this in this depth throughout the entire Middle Ages. This is what we are here for, so we can literally follow in progression all these dynamics. I hope it was clear. I tried to keep it schematic because, of course, if we were to descend into all the details, it would be utterly insane, right? But that's also what we enjoy, frankly, enough at some other point, and pretty much it for today. However, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.